The Sterling Tower loomed over downtown Manhattan like a monument to power, its 72-story glass facade catching the golden morning light in a dazzling display of wealth and influence. Luxury sedans lined the entrance in perfect formation, while armed security officers stood motionless beside polished black marble pillars, their eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. Inside, crystal chandeliers illuminated a lobby where executives in tailored suits hurried between meetings, their voices dropping to respectful whispers the moment they stepped through the rotating doors. Everyone knew one name: CEO Alexander Sterling, the billionaire chairman, the man feared by rival businessmen, the alpha whose influence stretched across 3 continents, whose empire touched everything from shipping to technology to private security. People whispered that one phone call from him could save a company or destroy it forever. At 39 years old, he possessed everything most people dreamed of: luxury, power, money, respect. Yet every night, he returned to an empty penthouse overlooking Central Park. For all his success, there was still one thing he could never buy: the chance to undo the greatest mistake of his life. Inside his private office on the top floor, silence filled the room like a living presence. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the sprawling Manhattan skyline, hundreds of people working beneath him, millions admiring him from afar. But Alexander was not looking at the city. His attention rested on a thin leather folder lying across his mahogany desk, its edges worn from years of handling. Slowly he opened it. Inside was an old divorce agreement, the paper slightly yellowed with age. 8 years. It had been 8 long years since he signed those documents, since he watched the love of his life walk out of the courthouse and disappear from his existence entirely. His finger stopped on a familiar signature: Ethan Brooks. The name hit him like a physical blow even now. The Omega he once believed he would spend the rest of his life with. The man whose scent had once filled every corner of his home, whose laugh had been the soundtrack to his happiest memories. His jaw tightened as memories flooded back, the arguments, the misunderstandings, the silence that had slowly destroyed their marriage. Then, the day Ethan walked away. He never asked for money, never fought over property, never begged Alexander to stay. He simply signed those papers with that quiet dignity that had always driven Alexander crazy, and disappeared so completely that even the best investigators in Sterling's employ could not find a single trace of him. Despite every resource at his command, Alexander had never found Ethan. Not because he did not search, God knew he searched, but because Ethan had vanished without leaving a single trace. No credit card transactions, no rental agreements, no hospital visits, nothing. As if the Omega had simply ceased to exist. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. His assistant, Marcus Webb, entered carefully, his beta scent neutral and unobtrusive. "Chairman Sterling? Your 9 o'clock meeting with the investors has been prepared." Alexander closed the folder. "What is it?" "The private equity team from London is already in the conference room." Marcus hesitated, his eyes flickering briefly to the folder Alexander still held. "Sir, you have been looking at those papers every morning this week." Alexander remained silent, his golden alpha eyes cold as winter steel. Marcus immediately lowered his head. "I am sorry. Forget you asked. Leave." The assistant quickly retreated, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Alexander stared at the closed door, his expression unreadable. Even the people closest to him never truly understood. They believed he regretted a failed marriage. A simple case of 2 people who could not make it work. They had no idea that he regretted losing the only Omega who had ever loved him before he became powerful, before the empire consumed every waking moment of his existence. Outside the headquarters, 3 black armored SUVs waited in formation, their engines purring like contented beasts. 6 elite bodyguards surrounded the vehicles, each wearing identical black suits with earpieces hidden beneath their hair. Pedestrians instinctively moved aside as the convoy prepared to depart. The streets of Manhattan had learned to recognize the Sterling convoy, and they knew better than to get in its way. Alexander entered the middle vehicle, and two bodyguards immediately flanked him, their alpha sense carefully suppressed. The convoy pulled away from Sterling Tower, merging smoothly into the chaos of downtown traffic. As they drove through the bustling streets, Alexander barely noticed the city around him. His mind wandered back to Ethan, the way the Omega used to smile when Alexander came home, the warmth of his scent after they made love, the firm way he would grip Alexander's shoulder when he was stressed, grounding him with his presence. He wondered where Ethan was now. Was he married again? Was he happy? Did he ever think about the alpha who had let him slip away? Or had he completely erased Alexander from his life? He sighed quietly, the sound lost beneath the hum of the engine. For 8 years, those questions had never found answers. The convoy approached a large intersection beside a peaceful city park, trees bursting with autumn colors that seemed almost too beautiful for the gray concrete jungle around them. The traffic light turned red, and all 3 SUVs stopped in perfect formation. Alexander turned toward the window out of habit, his eyes scanning the streets without really seeing them. Then everything changed. Across the street, an Omega sat on a wooden park bench beneath golden autumn trees. He wore a simple beige jacket, his chestnut hair moving gently in the autumn breeze. He smiled as he listened to 2 young boys talking excitedly, nodding at something they pointed to in the distance. Alexander froze. His breathing stopped. No, it could not be. He leaned closer to the window, his heart suddenly pounding against his ribs. After 8 years, there he was, Ethan. He looked older, more mature, his features sharpened by time and experience, his jaw more defined, his shoulders broader than Alexander remembered. But his smile had not changed, not one bit. The same steady, quiet smile Alexander had once fallen in love with. The 2 boys beside Ethan looked almost identical, twins. Each held one of Ethan's hands, their faces bright with childish excitement. They could not have been older than 7 or 8. One pointed toward a nearby ice cream cart, while the other laughed as Ethan gently brushed an autumn leaf from his hair. Ethan looked happy, a kind of happiness Alexander had not seen during the final months of their marriage, before the distance between them had become an unbridgeable chasm. Then something strange caught Alexander's attention. One of the boys looked up, his eyes scanning the street with a curiosity that seemed too sharp for a child his age. For only a second, his gaze met Alexander's through the glass. Alexander's eyes widened. The boy's face, his eyes, the shape of his jaw, even the way he frowned slightly at the unfamiliar car, it reminded him painfully of someone. Himself. His heart began pounding. No. The second boy turned his head, and Alexander felt the same shock ripple through him. Both boys carried features that seemed painfully familiar. The strong brow, the determined set of their mouths, the way they held themselves with unconscious confidence. Characteristics that had been in Alexander's own family for generations. The traffic light turned green. The driver prepared to move. Sir. Alexander never answered. His eyes remained locked on Ethan and the twins, his mind racing through impossibilities. The SUVs started rolling forward. Without thinking, Alexander shouted, "Stop the car." The driver slammed on the brakes, and every bodyguard immediately became alert, hands moving toward concealed weapons. Chairman Sterling? But Alexander had already opened the door, stepping onto the street before anyone could stop him. The autumn wind hit him, carrying 1,000 scents, car exhaust, city grime, the distant sweetness of fallen leaves. And beneath it all, so faint he almost missed it, the ghost of a scent he had never forgotten. Ethan rose and took both boys firmly by the hand, completely unaware that the alpha he had spent 8 years trying to forget had finally found him. Chairman. The bodyguards rushed toward Alexander as he stepped into the busy street. Cars slowed, horns blaring in protest. Pedestrians stopped to stare. No one had ever seen the powerful Sterling Alpha abandon his convoy in the middle of Manhattan traffic. Alexander ignored everyone. His eyes never left Ethan. The Omega was walking slowly through the park with the two boys, holding one hand of each child, his movements controlled and deliberate. The younger twin laughed at something his brother said, and Ethan's answering laugh was deep, rich and full, a sound that carried across the grass. "Dad, can we get ice cream?" the younger boy asked, his voice carrying across the distance. Ethan's deep laugh, rich and full, reached Alexander's ears, a sound he had not heard in 8 years. "Only if you both finish lunch first." The older twin grinned. "That is not fair. It is if you want to grow taller." The boys exchanged playful looks before bursting into laughter. Alexander's heart clenched. He had never imagined Ethan as a father, yet somehow, watching him with the twins, it suited him perfectly. He looked peaceful, happy, a happiness Alexander had not been able to give him, a happiness he had spent 8 years believing the Omega had found with someone else. One of the bodyguards stepped beside him. "Chairman, should we return to headquarters?" Alexander did not answer. Instead, he slowly crossed the road, his eyes fixed on the small family ahead. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself was trying to pull him back. The closer he got, the more familiar the twins looked, the shape of their eyes, their brows, even the way they walked with that unconscious confidence that had always been a sterling trait. His heartbeat became thunder in his ears. It could not be. It was impossible. 8 years. 8 years had passed, and yet Ethan suddenly stopped walking. A strange feeling seemed to creep over him, the instinctive awareness of being watched that all Omegas possessed. He slowly turned around, his chestnut hair catching the autumn light. His smile disappeared instantly. Standing only a few meters away was Alexander Sterling. For a brief, suspended second, time itself seemed to stop. Neither of them spoke, neither moved. The sounds of the city faded into distant background noise. Traffic and chatter and wind all rendered meaningless. Only their eyes remained locked together. 8 years of silence compressed into a single frozen moment. The younger twin looked between them, confusion clear on his young face. "Dad," Ethan did not answer. His hands instinctively clamped around the boy's shoulders, pulling them close against his sides. Alexander could not believe what he was seeing. The Omega he had searched for without success was standing right in front of him, alive, healthy, more handsome than ever, his jaw sharp and his shoulders square. But Ethan looked at him as if he were a complete stranger, his hazel eyes guarded where they had once been warm. Finally, Alexander spoke. "Ethan." His voice was barely a whisper, but Ethan heard it clearly. The Omega took a slow breath, steadying himself. "I did not expect to see you again. I searched everywhere." Ethan smiled faintly, a ghost of humor without warmth. "But you never found me." "No, I made sure you would not." Those words struck Alexander harder than he expected. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to him without fear, without respect for his wealth, without caring who he had become. Ethan simply spoke the truth, the same quiet honesty that had always been part of him. The older twin stepped slightly in front of Ethan, his small body adopting a protective stance that seemed far too mature for his age. He was not afraid. He was simply guarding his father. He looked directly at Alexander, his golden brown eyes sharp and assessing. "Mister, do you know our dad?" Alexander's eyes shifted toward the boy. For several seconds, he could not answer. Something about that face, the calm confidence, the upright posture, the way his gaze met Alexander's without flinching, reminded him painfully of himself when he was younger. The same stubborn set of the jaw, the same unshakable certainty. Ethan quickly replied, his voice carefully neutral. "He is someone I knew a long time ago." The boy nodded politely, accepting the answer with a maturity that seemed beyond his years. "Oh." He reached for Ethan's hand again, his small fingers intertwining with his father's. Alexander noticed the matching bracelets on both boys, the same birthday charms, the same initials engraved on the metal, DS and LS. His heart pounded faster. Sterling. Those could only be Sterling initials. The younger twin smiled brightly, oblivious to the tension. "Dad," Are we still going to Grandma's house? Ethan nodded, his mask of calm not quite hiding the tremor in his voice. Yes, we are already late. The boy turned toward Alexander, his grin still firmly in place. Goodbye, mister. Both twins bowed politely, a gesture that seemed almost old-fashioned in the heart of Manhattan. Their manners were flawless, their movements coordinated as if they had practiced. Alexander almost forgot to breathe. Even the way they bowed reminded him of the formal greetings his own father had drilled into him as a child. Ethan gently pulled the boys closer. We should go. Alexander finally stepped forward, his alpha instinct screaming at him to not let them leave again. Wait. Ethan stopped, but he did not turn around immediately. What is it? Alexander's voice became quieter, stripped of its usual commanding authority. I have so many questions. So do I. Another silence fell between them. The wind carried fallen leaves across the grass, a golden carpet that seemed almost symbolic. For a moment, neither knew what to say, caught in the trap of years of separation and misunderstanding. Alexander looked at the twins again, studying their young faces with desperate intensity. What are their names? Ethan hesitated, his grip on the boy's hands tightening. Then, quietly, he answered, Daniel. He touched the older twin's shoulder. And Leo. The twins smiled politely, their young faces open and friendly. Alexander repeated the names in his mind, hearing echoes of his own family in them. Daniel, his grandfather's name. Leo, a name he had never heard before, yet somehow already felt important. Names he had never heard before. Names that somehow already felt important. His assistant hurried over, breathless and alarmed. Chairman, we are going to be late for the investors. They are already waiting. Alexander ignored him completely. His attention remained fixed on Ethan. One question burned in his mind. One question that could change everything. How old are they? Ethan's expression changed. For the first time, something raw and vulnerable flickered behind his guarded eyes. He looked directly into Alexander's gaze, his voice low and rough. Exactly 8 years. The answer was calm, measured, but it shattered the world around Alexander. 8 years. Alexander stood frozen, his mind racing through the timeline. Their divorce. The weeks before they separated. The last time they had been intimate, when Ethan had begged him to come home instead of attending another business meeting, and Alexander had chosen the meeting. Everything suddenly began fitting together with terrible clarity. He slowly looked at the twins again, truly looking this time. Daniel's eyes, the shape of his jaw, Leo's determined expression, the way he held himself with unconscious confidence. Alexander saw himself in both of them. The legacy of the sterling alpha line that had been passed down for generations. Then he looked back at Ethan. For the first time, a terrifying possibility entered his heart. Were those boys his sons? The question echoed between them, impossible and undeniable. Are they my sons? Ethan's expression did not change, but Alexander saw the flash of pain that crossed his eyes before he could suppress it. He looked at Alexander for several long seconds, his hazel eyes filled with 8 years of resentment and longing. Then he turned toward the twins. Daniel, Leo, we are leaving. Without another word, he took both boys' hands and walked away from the park, his steps quick and purposeful. Alexander stood frozen, his heart screaming at him to run after them, while his mind told him to stay where he was. His heart won. Chairman. The bodyguards hurried after him as he crossed the street, cars blaring their horns in protest. A delivery truck screeched to a stop only inches from him, the driver rolling down his window with an angry curse. Are you trying to get yourself killed? The bodyguards immediately surrounded Alexander, one raising a hand toward the driver. Watch your mouth. Alexander stopped him. Leave him. His eyes never left Ethan's retreating form. The busy streets of Manhattan slowly transformed into the city's luxury shopping district. Designer stores, jewelry boutiques, elegant cafes, every building a monument to wealth and taste. Ethan walked confidently through the crowd, the twins happily admiring the colorful shop windows as they passed. Leo suddenly pointed excitedly. Dad, the watch shop. Ethan smiled, a genuine warmth softening his features. I know. We will stop for a minute. The three entered an elegant Swiss watch boutique, its interior bright with polished glass and gleaming metal. The manager immediately recognized Ethan, his face breaking into a professional smile. Mr. Brooks, your watch is ready. We have made the adjustments you requested. Thank you. The twins wandered toward a display of luxury clocks, their young faces filled with wonder. Leo laughed, pointing at an enormous grandfather clock. It is huge. Daniel smiled, his expression more thoughtful. I think Grandpa would like these. Ethan quietly laughed. Maybe one day. Outside the boutique, Alexander slowly approached, his heart pounding in his throat. He had sent the bodyguards away, needing to do this alone, needing to face Ethan without the trappings of his empire surrounding him. The twins noticed him almost immediately. Leo whispered loudly, Dad, he is here again. Ethan turned around. His smile disappeared the moment he saw Alexander standing at the entrance. Alexander stepped inside, ignoring the startled looks from the staff. I could not let you disappear again. Ethan's voice was cold, edged with anger and pain. You already let me disappear once. I did not. You did. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes blazing with 8 years of suppressed fury. I searched for you. I waited for you. I spent weeks hoping you would come after me, and you never did. You let me go, Alexander. Alexander shook his head, his alpha instincts roaring with the need to deny the accusation. I searched for you too. I hired investigators. You hired investigators? Ethan laughed bitterly. Then why did not you find me? I was not hiding in some foreign country, Alexander. I was right here, in New York, raising your children alone. If you had really searched, I did. I never stopped searching. The words struck both of them like knives. Neither realized they had spent 8 years believing the exact opposite story, each convinced the other had abandoned them without a second thought. Before Alexander could answer, the boutique doors burst open. 3 masked men rushed inside, their faces hidden beneath black ski masks. One carried a gun, its barrel gleaming under the bright store lights. Customers screamed, diving for cover. The manager raised his hands, trembling. Everyone on the floor. Now, the boutique erupted into chaos. Children cried. People ran for cover. Display cases shattered as the robbers smashed through them. The twins instinctively grabbed Ethan, pulling him down behind a counter. Alexander's eyes became ice cold. Without hesitation, he stepped in front of Ethan and the boys, positioning himself between them and the gunman. His alpha instincts took over completely, every sense sharpening to razor focus. The gunman laughed, gesturing with the weapon. Move, rich boy. Unless you want a bullet in that expensive suit. Alexander did not move. I said move. The gunman aimed directly at him. Through his earpiece, Alexander heard one of his bodyguards whisper, Chairman, permission? Alexander answered without taking his eyes off the robbers. Take them. The next second, everything exploded into action. The first bodyguard crashed through the glass door, disarming the gunman with one powerful strike to his wrist. The weapon clattered to the ground as the second bodyguard tackled another robber into a display case, glass shattering around them. The third criminal tried to escape through the back door, but Alexander moved first. Years of combat training had never left him, even in his years as a businessman. He grabbed the man's arm, twisting it sharply at the elbow. The robber screamed, his stolen bag crashing to the floor as Alexander drove him to the ground with practiced efficiency. Within seconds, all 3 robbers lay restrained, the bodyguards securing them with zip ties while calling for police backup. The boutique fell silent. Customers stared in complete disbelief, their fear slowly shifting to shock and admiration. The manager trembled, clutching the counter for support. You saved everyone. Alexander ignored him completely. He immediately turned around, his eyes searching for Ethan. Ethan, are you hurt? Ethan slowly shook his head, pulling the twins close against his sides, his stance protective. I am fine. We are fine. Alexander crouched down before the twins, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. What about you two? Are you okay? Daniel nodded bravely, his small hands steady despite the chaos around them. We are okay. Leo looked at Alexander with wide eyes, his youthful face filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. You fought those bad guys. Alexander smiled for the first time, a genuine smile that transformed his hard features into something almost boyish. I had good teachers. Leo's face lit up with sudden excitement. I want to be strong too. Ethan immediately interrupted, his voice sharp with protective concern. No. You will become a doctor. Daniel laughed, his expression teasing his brother. I thought I was becoming the doctor. Leo crossed his arms, his determination matching his father's. Then I will become stronger than him. For the first time in 8 years, Alexander laughed, a real laugh, one he had not heard from himself in years. The sound seemed to surprise even him. Ethan noticed it, and so did the twins. The tension between them softened, if only for a moment. Police sirens echoed outside, and officers rushed into the boutique moments later. One detective looked around the destroyed store before recognizing Alexander, his eyes widening with shock. Chairman Sterling? Is it true? You really stopped an armed robbery. Alexander simply replied, his voice returning to its usual calm authority. I protected innocent people. As the police arrested the robbers, Daniel quietly tugged on Ethan's sleeve. Dad, Ethan looked down, his expression softening as he met his son's gaze. Daniel glanced at Alexander, then whispered something that made Ethan's heart stop. He is not a bad man, is he? Ethan did not answer. Police officers rushed inside the boutique, one detective immediately approaching Alexander. Chairman Sterling, we will need your statement. I do not have time. Before he could move, his assistant Marcus rushed inside, breathing heavily. Chairman, the overseas investors have already arrived. The board meeting cannot be delayed any longer. Alexander looked past him, his eyes finding Ethan across the room. Ethan understood. This was his chance to disappear again before Alexander could ask more questions. He gently took Daniel's and Leo's hands. Boys, we are leaving. Leo looked back, his young face confused. But Dad, the man saved us. Ethan's expression tightened, his jaw working silently. I know. Let us go. The twins bowed politely toward Alexander, their manners as flawless as ever. Thank you, mister. Before Alexander could answer, Ethan disappeared with the boys into the busy shopping district. The crowds quickly swallowed them, their small forms vanishing among the shoppers and tourists. Alexander pushed past the officers. Ethan, wait. Ethan never looked back. A police officer stopped Alexander, his hand raised in a gesture of authority. Chairman, please, we need your statement. It is procedure. Alexander clenched his fists, his alpha instincts screaming at him to chase after them, to not let the Omega disappear again. Marcus spoke quietly beside him. Chairman, if you do not attend this meeting, the entire board is waiting. The investors flew in from London specifically for this. Alexander closed his eyes. For the second time in one day, he watched Ethan disappear into the crowd. When Ethan was completely out of sight, Alexander slowly turned toward his assistant, his voice cold and controlled. I want everything. Marcus blinked. Everything, sir? Everything about Ethan. Where he lives, where he works, who those boys are. Alexander's voice dropped to almost a whisper. And I want proof. Marcus nodded immediately. Yes, Chairman. Within seconds, 2 bodyguards disappeared into the crowd. Inside the luxury SUV, no one dared speak. Alexander stared through the window, his reflection staring back at him like a stranger. For years, he had negotiated billion-dollar deals without hesitation, built an empire from nothing, faced down rivals who would have killed him without a second thought. Today, 2 little boys had reduced him to silence. He replayed every detail. Daniel's calm confidence, Leo's bright smile, the way both boys instinctively protected their father. The more he remembered, the harder it became to breathe. An hour later, The board meeting had already begun. 30 executives sat around a polished conference table, charts covering the giant display screen. One director stood, his voice confident as he addressed the room. "Our third quarter profits have increased by..." Alexander interrupted him. Meeting adjourned. The room froze. "Chairman, I said it is over." The executives stared in disbelief. One investor protested loudly, his face red with outrage. "We flew from London for this meeting. You cannot simply. You will receive tomorrow's report." But the meeting is finished. No one dared argue further. Within minutes, the conference room was empty, the executives filing out with confused murmurs. Only Alexander remained, staring at the empty table. Late that afternoon, a black folder landed on his desk. Marcus entered quietly, his voice carefully neutral. "You asked for information. We found more than we expected, sir." Alexander immediately opened the file. The first page contained only one photograph. Ethan standing outside a modest apartment building in Brooklyn, his face turned toward the camera with an expression of quiet determination. The second page contained photographs of Daniel and Leo wearing matching school uniforms, their small faces serious as they entered a private school. The third page was school records, and Alexander's eyes stopped on one line. Date of birth, exactly 8 years ago. His hands tightened on the folder. Marcus continued, his voice steady. "They are twins. I can see that. They have attended the same school since kindergarten. No father is listed on any document, sir." Alexander slowly looked up. "What?" Marcus nodded, his expression grave. "Every school document lists only their father, Ethan Brooks. No emergency contact. No relatives. Just Ethan." The teachers described both boys as respectful, disciplined, and extremely protective of their father. Alexander's heartbeat became thunder in his ears. He turned another page, medical records, family information. Again, father's name, not provided. If Ethan had wanted another alpha to raise those boys, why leave that space blank? Marcus hesitated, then added quietly, "There is something else, sir." "What?" "We interviewed several neighbors. They all believe Ethan is a widower. They have never seen the boy's father, and Ethan never discusses him. The assumption has been that he died years ago." Silence filled the office. Alexander closed the folder. For 8 years, he had been searching for the Omega he loved. And all that time, Ethan had been raising their sons alone, letting the world believe Alexander was dead. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his mind churning with a storm of emotions. The photograph of Ethan with the twins was still burning in his memory. The way the Omega had looked so complete, so content, as if he had built an entire life without Alexander, as if Alexander had never existed at all. The thought sent a sharp pang of something between jealousy and grief through his chest. He had missed everything. The first time Daniel had spoken, the first time Leo had walked, their first day of school, their first sports games, their first everything. He had been building an empire, chasing power and wealth, thinking those things would fill the emptiness inside him. But now, staring at the photographs of his sons, he realized how hollow all of it was. What good was an empire if he had no one to share it with? What use was power if he could not protect the family he had lost? The weight of those missing years pressed down on Alexander like a physical force. He thought about all the nights he had come home to an empty penthouse, all the meals he had eaten alone, all the holidays he had spent in silence. Meanwhile, Ethan had been just across the city, raising their sons, struggling alone, believing Alexander had abandoned him. The injustice of it made Alexander's alpha rage simmer beneath his controlled exterior. Someone had done this to them. Someone had deliberately torn them apart, had intercepted letters and phone calls, had made sure neither of them could reach the other. And now Alexander knew who that someone was, his own father. The man who was supposed to protect the family had instead destroyed it in the name of preserving legacy. Alexander's hands clenched into fists on the desk. The rage he felt toward his father was unlike anything he had ever experienced. This was not business rivalry or professional competition. This was personal. This was a betrayal so deep that Alexander was not sure if he could ever forgive it. His father had taken away 8 years of his children's lives, 8 years of his Omega's happiness, 8 years of his own chance to be a father. How could anyone do that to their own blood? How could anyone justify that kind of cruelty? He forced himself to breathe, to calm the raging alpha instincts that wanted to lash out and destroy something. He could not afford to lose control now. He had to be strategic. He had to think clearly. The first priority was Ethan and the boys. They were the most important thing in his life now, far more important than any business deal or corporate rivalry. He needed to approach this carefully, to rebuild the trust that had been so cruelly shattered. 8 years of separation could not be undone in a single day, but Alexander was determined to try. He would spend the rest of his life making up for what had been stolen from them. At the same moment, across the city, Ethan tucked the twins into bed. Daniel looked at his father, his young face serious. "Dad, who was that man today?" Ethan froze. Leo added softly, "He looked sad." Ethan sat beside them, his heart heavy. For several seconds, he could not answer. Then he pressed a firm kiss to each of their foreheads, his voice low and rough. "One day, I will tell you everything." Outside the apartment building, 2 black SUVs waited silently beneath the streetlights. Inside one of them, Alexander Sterling sat alone. His eyes never left Ethan's apartment window, a warm glow spilling out into the autumn night. He was not there to threaten Ethan, was not there to take the boys. He only wanted one answer. Had he really spent 8 years searching for the Omega he loved, while his own twin sons were growing up without ever knowing their alpha father? The next morning, rain washed the streets of Manhattan clean. Alexander arrived at Sterling Tower wearing a dark gray suit instead of his usual black. His employees immediately noticed the change, but no one dared ask why. Inside his office, Marcus was already waiting. "Good morning, Chairman. Did you find anything more?" Marcus placed another file on the desk. "Yes, sir." Alexander opened it immediately. The first page contained several new photographs. Ethan walking the twins to school every morning, always alone. No alpha at his side. No beta companion. Just the Omega and his sons. Alexander frowned. "No partner." Marcus shook his head. "None, sir. For 8 years, he has raised them by himself." Alexander slowly leaned back, his heart growing heavier. "What about the boys?" Marcus turned another page. "Daniel ranks first in his mathematics class. Leo is the captain of the school football team." The teachers described both boys as respectful, disciplined, and extremely protective of their father. Alexander could not hide a faint smile. "They sound like good children." "They are, sir. But there is something strange." Alexander looked up instantly. "What?" "The father section on every school record is completely blank. No name, no emergency contact, no mention of any alpha whatsoever." Silence filled the office. Alexander looked at another photograph. Ethan standing in the middle while Daniel and Leo hugged him from both sides, their small faces filled with love. They looked happy, complete, without him. For the first time, Alexander wondered how many birthdays he had missed. How many school plays? How many bedtime stories? His chest tightened with grief. "Marcus." "Yes, Chairman." "The twins were born exactly 8 years ago, were not they?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. We confirmed it." Alexander closed the file. He already knew what that meant, but hearing it confirmed made everything worse. Across the city, Ethan left his apartment wearing a light brown jacket. Daniel and Leo wore matching navy blue school uniforms, their backpacks slung over their shoulders. "Bye, Dad. Study hard." "We will, Dad." Ethan smiled as they entered the school gate, their small forms disappearing into the building. Then he turned toward the bus stop, his steps unhurried. He never noticed the black SUV parked across the street. Inside, 2 bodyguards watched quietly, one speaking into his earpiece. "Chairman, he is alone. The boys just entered school." Alexander answered, his voice calm but intense. "Stay here. I will go myself." He stepped out of the SUV, wearing civilian clothes to blend in. No security, no assistance, just him. Ethan sensed someone approaching. He turned around. His smile disappeared. Alexander Sterling stood only a few steps away, his golden eyes fixed on Ethan with an intensity that made the Omega's heart skip a beat. Neither spoke immediately. Morning traffic passed behind them, but neither noticed. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. I did not come here to argue. Ethan folded his arms, a defensive gesture Alexander remembered all too well. Then why are you here? I need answers. Just like yesterday, and I still do not have them. Alexander stepped closer, his voice dropping to something almost vulnerable. Ethan, please. I have spent 8 years wondering what happened to you. I need to know the truth. Ethan looked into his eyes, something shifting in his expression. You will not like the truth. I will decide that. Ethan sighed, his shoulders sagging with the weight of years. The truth will not only change your life, Alexander. It will change the lives of 2 innocent boys. Alexander's heart pounded. Then tell me. Ethan slowly shook his head. Not here. Why? Because they deserve better than hearing their entire history broken to them on the side of a road. Alexander lowered his voice, matching Ethan's urgency. Then where? Ethan looked toward a small cafe across the street, its windows fogged with warmth. We will talk there. Inside the cafe, the morning crowd was small. Ethan chose a quiet corner away from everyone else, his back to the wall in a way that spoke of ingrained caution. Alexander sat opposite him, every instinct focused on the Omega. For the first time in years, neither of them knew how to begin. A waitress approached, her notepad ready. What can I get for you today? Ethan smiled politely, his voice steady. Tea, please. Earl Grey. Alexander answered without looking away from Ethan. Black coffee. Strong. The waitress left, and silence returned. Alexander finally spoke, his voice strained. You said the truth would change everything. It will. Then tell me. Ethan looked directly into his eyes, his hazel gaze unflinching. Before I answer, I need you to answer one question. Alexander nodded. What is it? The day I disappeared, did you really come looking for me? Alexander frowned, confusion clear on his face. I searched for months. I hired investigators. I went back to our apartment every week. Ethan's expression slowly changed. You did? Yes. When I came back from the business trip, you were already gone. I thought you left me. I thought you chose to leave. Ethan laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. I thought you abandoned me. Neither spoke. Both had spent 8 years believing the same lie. Their drinks arrived, but neither touched them. Ethan slowly removed a small envelope from his jacket pocket, placing it on the table between them. Alexander looked at it, his heart suddenly racing. What is this? Open it. He carefully unfolded the papers inside. Hospital documents. His eyes moved down the page, scanning the medical terminology. Patient name, Ethan Brooks. Examination date, 8 years earlier. Pregnancy confirmation. Alexander looked up, his hands trembling. You were? Ethan nodded, his voice low and rough. Pregnant. I found out 2 weeks before the divorce. Alexander could not speak. I wanted to tell you. But every time I tried, you were surrounded by lawyers, business meetings, investors. You never had time. You never made time. Alexander whispered. Why did not you call me? I did. You never answered. I wrote letters. You never replied. I even came to your office, but security told me you refused to see me. Alexander's face turned pale. I never received anything. I never knew. I know that now. Ethan lowered his eyes. I realized much later that someone was intercepting everything. A long silence followed. Alexander's mind raced, fitting the pieces together. The intercepted letters, the security guards who had refused Ethan entry, the careful orchestration of their separation. Finally, Alexander asked, his voice breaking. So the twins. Ethan finished the sentence for him. They are yours. The words echoed inside Alexander's mind. Everything around him disappeared. The cafe, the morning traffic, the ordinary sounds of New York City. Only Ethan's words remained. reverberating through his consciousness. They are yours. He remembered their eyes, their smiles, their mannerisms. It all suddenly made sense. His eyes glistened, the first tears he had shed in decades. I have 2 sons. Ethan nodded quietly. You always did. Alexander reached across the table, his hand hovering near Ethan's, hesitant to touch. I missed everything. Their first steps, their first words, their first day at school. I missed all of it. Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes glistening. I missed having someone beside me. I missed waking up next to you. I missed, his voice broke. I missed you, Alexander. Every single day. Alexander finally took Ethan's hand, his grip gentle but desperate. I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. Ethan laughed wetly, shaking his head. 8 years, Alexander. 8 years I spent hating you, and all this time, I was hating myself, Alexander finished. I blamed myself for letting you go, for not trying harder, for not fighting for you. Ethan squeezed his hand. We were both manipulated. We were both lied to. I know who did it. Ethan's eyes widened. What? Alexander's expression hardened, the grief slowly being replaced by cold determination. My father. He intercepted your letters. He paid off security. He made sure we never found each other. Ethan pulled his hand back, shock and anger warring on his face. Your father? Why would he? He thought you were unsuitable. He thought an Omega without connections would weaken the sterling legacy. Alexander's voice dripped with contempt. He was willing to destroy his own son's happiness to protect his precious bloodline. Ethan stared at him, processing the information. Then, slowly, a bitter laugh escaped him. So all these years I thought you abandoned me, and all these years you thought I abandoned you, and your father just sat back and watched us suffer? He saw it as protecting the family. Protecting the family? Ethan's voice rose, drawing glances from nearby tables. He stole my children's father from them. He stole 8 years of my life. Alexander reached for him again, his alpha instincts screaming to soothe the Omega. I know, and I am going to make it right. How can you possibly make it right? First, I am going to confront him. Then I am going to remove him from everything. And then, Alexander's voice softened, I am going to spend the rest of my life proving to you and our sons that I never stopped loving any of you. Ethan searched his face, looking for any trace of deception. All he found was raw, open sincerity. You really searched for me? Every single day? For 8 years. I told myself you moved on. I told myself you had married some wealthy Omega from a good family. Ethan shook his head. I never imagined. I could never move on from you. Alexander's voice was fierce. You were the only one who ever mattered. The empire, the money, the power, none of it meant anything without you. Ethan wiped his eyes, trying to compose himself. This is so overwhelming. I do not know how to process all of this. We will take it slowly, one step at a time. Alexander hesitated, then added carefully, but I need to ask you something. What? Will you give me a chance? Not to fix everything at once. I know that is impossible, but to be part of your life again? To be a father to our sons. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then, so softly Alexander almost missed it, he said, I do not know if I can trust you yet, but I want to try. Alexander's heart soared. That is all I am asking for. Just a chance. Alexander's phone buzzed again, and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from Marcus. Your father is in your office. He found the files. Alexander's expression darkened. I have to go? My father knows you are back. Ethan's face paled. What will happen? I am going to deal with him. But first, Alexander pulled out his wallet and extracted a business card. This has my private number. Call me whenever you are ready. Ethan took the card, his fingers brushing against Alexander's. The touch sent a spark through both of them. I will. Alexander stood, his eyes lingering on Ethan. This is not goodbye. Not again. Ethan nodded, something vulnerable flickering in his hazel eyes. No, not again. Back at Sterling Tower, Alexander stormed into his father's office. The older Alpha was standing by the window, his back to the door, the investigation file open on the desk before him. "You have no right to be here," Alexander said, his voice cold as ice. Marcus Sterling Sr. turned slowly, his steel-gray eyes meeting his son's with an expression of cold authority. "I have every right. I built this company. I built this family. Everything you have, everything you are, came from me. You built nothing but lies." Alexander stepped closer, his alpha presence filling the room with barely restrained fury. "You destroyed my marriage. You stole my children from me. You made me believe the man I loved abandoned me when you were the one who drove him away." Marcus Sr. laughed dryly, the sound devoid of humor. "You think that matters to me? I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. What I care about is legacy, and that Omega will destroy everything you have built. He gave me 2 sons. 2 sons you hid from me for 8 years. Alexander's voice was barely controlled. "You stole their childhood. You stole their chance to know their father. You stole my chance to watch them grow up. They were not your children then. They were the Omega's children, carrying his blood, his weaknesses. I could not allow them to be heirs to the Sterling fortune. They would have diluted everything I worked for." Marcus Sr. shook his head. "I did what was necessary to protect our name." "Our name?" Alexander laughed bitterly. "You have no idea what our name means. It means nothing without family. It means nothing without the people we love. You built an empire, father, but you never built a home." The older Alpha's expression flickered, something almost like regret crossing his features before it hardened again. "You are making a mistake. The only mistake I ever made was trusting you." Alexander stepped closer, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "As of today, you are removed from every position at Sterling Industries. The board will be informed within the hour. Your name will be erased from every document, every plaque, every record. You will be forgotten." Marcus Sr. stared at his son, his face pale. "You cannot do that. I built this company from nothing. You built it, and now I am tearing it down, at least the part of it that belongs to you." Alexander's voice was final. "You will leave this building. You will never contact me, never contact Ethan, never contact my sons. If you do, I will make sure the world knows exactly what you did." The older Alpha opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. For the first time in his life, Marcus Sterling Sr. had nothing to say. He had finally lost everything. Not because of business, not because of rivals, but because of family. He walked toward the door, pausing at the threshold. "You will regret this." Alexander did not turn around. "I already regret the 8 years I lost. I will not regret protecting what is left." Hours later, Alexander received a text message from an unknown number. It was Ethan. "The boys want to see you. Tomorrow afternoon. The park where we first met again." Alexander's hands trembled as he typed his reply. "I will be there." He spent the rest of the evening in his penthouse, unable to sleep, his mind racing with thoughts of what he would say to the boys. Would they accept him? Would they be afraid? Would they ever be able to see him as their father after 8 years of absence? He had faced down armed men, negotiated billion-dollar deals, built an empire from nothing. But the thought of 2 little boys looking at him with rejection in their eyes terrified him more than anything else in the world. The next day, Alexander arrived at the park an hour early. He wore casual clothes, jeans, a simple sweater, hoping to seem less intimidating to the boys. He paced back and forth near the bench where he had first seen Ethan with the twins, his heart pounding with nervous anticipation. When Ethan and the twins finally appeared, Alexander stopped pacing, his breath catching in his throat. Daniel and Leo walked beside their father, their young faces curious but not afraid. They were wearing matching blue jackets, their backpacks slung over their shoulders, and they held Ethan's hands as they approached. Ethan gave Alexander a small nod, a silent gesture of encouragement. Alexander crouched down to the boy's level, his voice thick with emotion. "Daniel, Leo." He spoke their names carefully, as if they were precious, as if he had been waiting his whole life to say them. "I am Alexander. I am," he paused, his voice breaking, "I am your father." Daniel studied him with those serious eyes, so like Alexander's own. "Are you going to leave again?" The question struck Alexander like a physical blow. He shook his head fiercely, his alpha instincts roaring with the need to protect, to reassure, to never let them doubt again. Never. I will never leave any of you again. I promise. Leo stepped forward, his young face bright with hope. Promise. Alexander held out his hand, palm open, his eyes locked on the boy's. I promise. With everything I have. With every breath I take. I will be here for you for the rest of my life. Daniel looked at his brother, then back at Alexander. Slowly, hesitantly, he stepped forward and placed his small hand in Alexander's. The touch sent a shock wave through Alexander's entire body, his son's hand in his, warm and real and alive. Leo followed, his grin wide and genuine. You are really our dad? I really am. Alexander's voice was barely a whisper. Leo launched himself forward, wrapping his small arms around Alexander's neck. The impact nearly knocked Alexander off balance, but he held on, his arms coming up to embrace his son for the first time. Daniel hesitated only a moment before joining the embrace, his serious face softening as he pressed himself against Alexander's side. Alexander held both of his sons, tears streaming down his face, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. He looked up at Ethan, who stood watching with his own eyes glistening. Alexander reached out his hand, and Ethan took it, crouching down to join the embrace. For the first time in 8 years, they were together, all 4 of them, a family finally reunited. Weeks passed, and Alexander kept his promise. He attended every school event, every football match, every parent-teacher conference. He sat through endless games of Monopoly with the twins, helped them with their homework, read them bedtime stories every night. He learned that Daniel loved mathematics and could solve puzzles faster than any adult Alexander knew. He learned that Leo was fiercely competitive on the football field, but gentle with his younger classmates. He learned that both boys had inherited their father's stubborn determination and their alpha father's strength. And every night, after the twins were asleep, Alexander would sit with Ethan on the couch, their hands intertwined, talking about the years they had lost. Ethan told him about the difficult early years, the sleepless nights, the exhaustion of raising 2 children alone. Alexander listened, his heart aching with every word, and he promised himself that he would make up for every moment of hardship. One evening, Alexander came home from a meeting to find the penthouse filled with the smell of cooking. Ethan was in the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up, stirring a pot on the stove. Daniel and Leo were at the counter doing their homework, and the sight of them, his family, together, in the home that had once been so empty, brought tears to Alexander's eyes. He walked over to Ethan and wrapped his arms around him from behind, pressing his face into the Omega's neck. I love you, Alexander whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Ethan leaned back into the embrace, his body relaxing against Alexander's. I love you too. The twins looked up, their faces breaking into grins. Dad, Papa, are you guys hugging again? Alexander laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Get over here, you two. Daniel and Leo ran over and joined the embrace, their small bodies pressing against their father's. Alexander held his family close, his heart full to bursting. He had spent 8 years searching for something he thought he had lost forever, but he had not lost it. It had been waiting for him all along. One warm spring afternoon, the family returned to the same park where everything had changed. The twins raced across the grass, their laughter bright as sunshine, their small forms darting between the trees. Ethan smiled as he watched them, his hazel eyes soft with happiness. Alexander gently took his hand, their fingers intertwining. I promised you once that I would never leave. Ethan looked at him, something peaceful in his expression. This time, keep that promise. Alexander smiled. For the rest of my life. The twins turned around and shouted together, their young voices carrying across the park. Dad, Papa, hurry. Ethan laughed, the sound bright and free. Alexander laughed with him, the joy of the moment washing away years of pain. Hand in hand, they ran toward their sons. Not as strangers, not as people haunted by the past, but as a family finally reunited after 8 long years. Alexander watched Ethan's chestnut hair bouncing as they ran, saw the way the Omega's hand fit perfectly in his, and felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly stopped him in his tracks. He had spent so many years building an empire, chasing power and wealth, thinking those things would fill the emptiness inside him. But it was not money that made him whole. It was this, running through a park on a spring afternoon, his Omega's hand in his son's laughter ahead of him. It was the family he had almost lost, the family he would spend the rest of his life protecting. Sometimes the greatest victories are not won through power or wealth. Sometimes they are won by never giving up on the people you love. Alexander tightened his grip on Ethan's hand, his heart full to bursting. For 8 years, he had searched for something he thought he had lost forever. But he had not lost it. It had been waiting for him all along.